And now we go through and share screen here. All right. Okay, here we go. Welcome in person, online, however you're watching this, to what is now the third class for the Irish language's version of Power kind of class module, whatever you want to call it, that I've been doing. This one, apologies, going to be focusing on media and communications. The media comms part of this is actually less related to Irish. It just kind of applies to really any language you're doing this in. And then at the end of this, I'll go into more Irish specific stuff for the things that we've been going over and how I might want to be using that. But for the first part, we'll be fairly general, intentionally so. And really, there's sort of three things that I want to talk about in terms of media and communications. Press releases. I've got a mailing list reference that you can use for any sort of stuff that you do. And the third one here, which I forgot to update on there actually, is a small bit about social media and how to develop a presence there. That's a little bit less intensive. There's a lot less maybe nuance to it in a certain way. There's a lot more nuance in another way. But for this, I'm going to focus really heavily on press releases, press communication, because that's really what lets you go from being a smaller local group to getting this at a potentially to a national level of awareness. Social media is great, but that is primarily used for people who already support you. So there's a different role there. And the purpose of this class is really, how do I go from my local group that already supports this to getting this to a national level? Obviously, I'll cover some Irish at the end as well. I'm also going to be ending slightly earlier today, partly because I've got personal commitments myself, and partly because I realize there's a variety of marches and protests going around, and I hardly want to be the one uploading, activist toolkits and stuff, and then telling people not to go to a protest. So, I know that most of those are occurring afternoon, so I will try to get this to be ended a little bit before that, so that we are able to, anyone who has other commitments or who is attending these protests can do so. Anyway, without further ado, press releases, news media, what's going on here, and why do we care? So, press releases are how you communicate with news media. And hopefully this means that they pick up the story that you wrote. They're one of the most powerful tools that you have because, fortunately and unfortunately, news sources often publish press releases as they're received, with often very few edits to the actual content. Obviously, they'll use different words. They won't plagiarize the press release. But often you'll see that the tone, the narrative, and the story that you construct in a press release carried over almost exactly into news pieces. And this happens especially when these come from established sources and organizations, which means that this can actually be, in a way, a danger when you're trying to put out information, because stuff that comes out of the government will be published almost exactly as is, very, very quickly. Although that typically applies to even smaller organizations as well. So take a look here, case study. This is one that I ran into, I think this was 2 years ago now. And it's a very interesting look at how press releases work. Press release here is on the left. The news article published in the Irish Times is on the right. And so what you'll see here, we don't need to go through this in immense detail on the slide, but what you see here is that the headline here, in terms of content, is very, very similar. You see in one case, you've got Taoiseach and Minister Harris are announcing a new program to recruit and train talent. Cool. And then on the right, State to Learn new PhD students with 28K yearly research stipend. Quite frankly, the Irish Times has a better headline on that. The press release really was not writing that headline properly. But as soon as you read the first couple of paragraphs of this press release, you see that all of that information has been more or less copied over one-to-one into this news article. And it doesn't stop there. If we start going through what I'm calling copy and paste news here, we can look at side by side, here's what's in the press release, and here's what's in the Irish Times. So in the press release, we have Minister Simon Harris, the Minister for Higher Education, who is going through a series of statements on this new Innovate for Ireland program he's announcing. And you see the highlighted parts here are the quotes that have just been directly copied over. And the reason I highlight this, it's kind of two reasons. The first one is, the first thing you see here is that exactly what Simon Harris, Minister Harris, wanted in this press release goes exactly into headline national media, exactly as said, exactly as written. Now, I'm going to go back here for 1 second. If you look in here at the kind of fine print, you notice the press release was published on the 1st of July, 2022. The news article was published the 1st of July, 2022. So these were published the exact same day. What does this tell you? When this press release was written, it was immediately picked up by the Irish Times, because this is from a major source, one of the government ministers. They copied over a load of different quotes. And very importantly, they never interviewed or talked to Simon Harris. They just pulled these quotes out of the press release. But if you hadn't known about this press release, you might have thought, oh, Simon Harris was talking to the Irish Times. But most quotes you see in newspapers are actually pulled out of press releases. So they're prepared, rehearsed, and heavily edited statements that say exactly what the press release wants them to. So these press releases let you define the narrative. And that can be used for good or evil, obviously. But quite frankly, what the effect of them is to let the person who writes them define the narrative. It doesn't quite stop there. Let's go on here. Professor Philip Nolan referenced in the press release. He's the Director General of Science Foundation Ireland. And we see once again mentioned the same name, same affiliation. Obviously, that makes sense. And once again, pulling that quote over. Wasn't interviewed for this article either. They just pulled a quote out of a press release. And it happens again. Donald Slattery, CEO of Avalon, has all of this information here. Less of this was taken, but look what happened in the Irish Times here. Donald Slattery, Chief Executive of Dublin Aircraft Leasing Company, Avalon. They just added more context into what this Avalon is. And that's really important, because if we go back here, we see the parts I bolded, the names and the affiliation, name and affiliation, name and affiliation for Simon Harris, for Philip Nolan, for Donald Slattery. And all of a sudden you realize this is doing more than just transforming what the press release said into a news article. This is specifically promoting certain groups and individuals and allowing them to take the front and center stage. Once again, this can be done honestly and with good intent. This can be done with bad intent. But the fact of the matter is that a good press release immediately takes control of the narrative. More or less, they let you write headlines for you that you want to see in the media and put statements and commitments on the record. So that's why we care about this, is because a good press release, a formal, very professionally written press release, can immediately get, if we go back here, what you're saying, more or less copy pasted into a news article with different words. This won't always happen, but especially for things like this, published the same day, for big announcements, you'll see this happening quite a bit. So jumping back here, PR is extremely powerful. As I said, you define the narrative. You can specifically promote certain groups and individuals. You can have these define and write headlines for you and put statements, commitments on the record you can reference later. There are some problems, even more problems. You can also use press releases to get very quick political points and to very quickly try to build up political support, and then to evade scrutiny. And why can you do that? Because all of these press organizations that write news have tons of news to write. And just because they write an article once doesn't mean they follow up on it. If we look at, if we go this web page I've QR coded here and the link that's available right there, will take you to another government web page, and you'll see information on the same Innovate for Ireland scholarship there. This web page was last updated 2023. I'm not sure when this part was last updated. That level of information just isn't on the website. But the web page was last updated 2023, and I believe it was March 1. And you'll see this very interesting statement here about Innovate for Ireland. The program will begin in 2023 and will be open to Irish and international students. Standard. It's the end of 2023 right now. I did some Google searches this morning to see if I could pull up anything recent on this, and this was the most recent statement I had seen. Something that was updated this year, and there isn't even information on when the program begins, how it's being run, where the funding is coming from, any of that. The press didn't follow up on this story, or if they did, it wasn't easy to find anywhere. It wasn't coming up in any of the searches I was looking at. So really, immediately what happened here, this 2022 publication by the Department of Higher Education by Simon Harris immediately would have scored a lot of points for Simon Harris. He's got a new program. He's trying to expand Irish talent. And all of a sudden, it's a year and a half later, nothing has happened. People forgot, but they're left with that good impression because he controlled the narrative. And so far as I've seen, this hasn't been updated on anytime recently. Now, I think I have the point here. Recently, just very recently, there's something very similar to this that happened. Simon Harris's department committed to raise some PhD stipends to 22K per annum, which is notably short of the 28K that he had originally promised in this Innovate for Ireland scholarship, which, to be fair, was not for all PhDs, it's for a very small subset. This relationship was not reported on in the media. And so the entire point of this case study is to show how much that these press releases can control a narrative, especially in an area that's so fast moving as higher education, where it's really hard to follow up on every single news story that comes out. So, and like I said, it's almost 2024 here. Maybe there will be something later on about this. Maybe there have been memos published that haven't been widely circulated. But for the moment, this is not making headline news the way that it did a year and a half ago, July 1 in 2022. So that's kind of the entire background, backdrop importance of a press release here, is that it lets you immediately take this kind of control. So, like I said, this can let you get cheap wins in the public eye. And that's very often used and very easy to use by the government and by very big, very influential groups and corporations. So subverting that and challenging that is something that can be very important to do. Because since the other important thing here is you now have a statement on the record that something's going to happen because it was made to the press. And you know that the press doesn't follow up on every single thing because, quite frankly, they can't always. While this is easy for a cheap political win on the behalf of the government, this also gives you evidence to come back at these organizations and to say, hey, you made this commitment at this time. I can reference this in both national media and in your press release. I haven't seen this followed up on in any concrete new programs. And, maybe these other things give me doubt about this. What's your reply to that? And that all of a sudden lets you subvert what they were trying to do there. So because PRs are so easy, because they let you almost write a news article sometimes, when they're used irresponsibly, it's easy to subvert the group that had been doing that. It's easy to go against that. It's easy to challenge that. So those are kind of the major points of a press release of why we care about doing these well. Obviously, if you're writing a press release, you also want to define what the narrative around your topic is going to be. You want to get your commitments and statements into the media, and you want to be able to hopefully set the tone of discussion around what you're releasing about. That's all fine. The importance here is that when you do this, that it has to be honest, because if it isn't, if somebody comes back and wants to subvert this, challenge this, discredit what you've said, that'll be fairly easy to do. Obviously, of course, honesty being the best policy regardless, but from the purely Machiavellian point of view, there actually is a point to that you need to follow through on that kind of stuff, as well as defining the narrative in the beginning. So hopefully that makes a good amount of sense. I'm going to head back here, pause for 1 second. Any questions on this sort of case study, on what's going on here, or on why I chose this one particularly to kind of analyze what a press release kind of means? Cool. Seems like that's all good. So let's skip on to the next point here. Actually writing a press release. So hopefully now I've convinced you that these things matter, that they can be used very well, both for and against things that you will care about. How do you actually write this? To be honest here, first of all, this template's in English. Why is this template in English? Because this class is in English. There's no reason necessarily to write a press release in any particular language unless you are specifically targeting Irish language media with Irish language issues. But even then, the vast majority of Irish language media will receive their press releases in English. Not that I think that's a great thing, but the fact of the matter is the language of the press release is less important than the substance of it. And of course, getting the substance of it, having templates for every possible press release is really, really hard. So I'm going to instead focus on just the content of the press release for this, and we can go into the Irish later on in this same class. So press release template. There are 4 parts to this. The first thing is a headline. And I'm going to say this over and over. You want to write this headline as if you're writing a headline for the Irish Times or Belfast Telegraph or, any of, Irish Examiner, any of these major organizations, New York Times. You want to write it as if it's a headline that you would see them put in print. Maybe slightly more detail, but you want to write it as if it's a news like headline, and then right below it, just the same way that news organizations do, put a 1-sentence subhead that provides additional context and sets the narrative that you want to see published. What this is going to do is immediately when people look at this, they see what is your point on this. They see, why am I putting out this press release? What is the aim? What is its thesis, so to speak? What is the intent? It also is part of this whole thing of making sure that what you do is represented the way that you want it represented. That is a very important thing. If you write a press release and news media turns around and represents it in a way that you didn't expect or want, that could have just hurt whatever movement you're building up. So you do need to control the narrative here. That doesn't have to be a dishonest thing, because a lot of times the quote unquote controlling the narrative is simply making sure people understand what you're saying. So the headline and the 1-sentence subhead really are there to establish that right from the get-go. You will typically, in the headline, you can put press release : and then whatever your headline is, so it's very clear what this is. But you more or less write it that way. Information. 2 to 4 paragraphs on what happened. Write that again a bit like a news article. This doesn't mean that you have to refer to things in kind of obtuse ways, but it really is focus on what happened. Write in the same sort of voice that these news medias will often use, which is a passive voice-based thing in many cases. And to write it in a way, that isn't using tons of I's or U's, refer to people by their last names, not their first names. When you refer to them by only one name. So if you're talking about, to use the example again, Minister Simon Harris, once you say, Minister for Higher Education Simon Harris once, you can simply say Minister Harris, but use the last name there, make it look formal, make it look professional. 2 to 4 paragraphs on that. The entire part of this, that background information and the headline subhead, that should be well under a page. Next part, statements. Give the name, association, and the quote for these. So you could say, Shahar Sardina, in the role blank of organization blank said, and whatever it is you want to say. Just put a list of these. And Then after that, if you want, you can give 1 to 3 paragraphs of background. For example, this you might have, if we use the same case study again of this new PhD program that was being announced, you might say, hey, previously the government has funded these other programs which has had this level of success, stuff like that. And immediately that's providing the background context for what you're saying. Because when you look at writing a news article, what happens is, as someone who's actually worked with student media, but interestingly, you actually see very much similarities between student media and national media in Ireland. It's a little bit weird sometimes. They often try to write the same kind of articles. You listen to the same talks, you read the same everything. What happens is you get this same sort of structure in any sort of article that you're reading or writing, where you get, here's the headline, here's some basic information, people said this, and here's the background. And that's actually a really common structure for this kind of stuff. If you look in the Irish Times, you'll see similar things. If you look in a lot of these major news sources, you'll see similar things. And you want to write your press release similarly structured to a news article with slightly more information here. And oh, that's another thing. These bolded parts here, I would keep a bolded section that says information and then have the 4 paragraphs there. Make it easy to parse. This isn't a news article. It's supposed to be a little bit easier to read in the sense of how to construct a news article from this, but it's very much intended that I have a similar structure. Before I go to that, I'm actually going to take a step here off of, my screen might not be being shared. Okay, let me reshare my entire screen. There we go. Entire screen is being shared now. And I'm actually going to go back to where we had seen these articles here and show you this, once again, this exact structure of the press release and how that structure is really carried over into this published article. So turn this into not dark mode, might be slightly more intuitive. Let's look at this press release first. We see here the first title. We see some information who was published by, fairly standard stuff. And then they don't have a specific subhead here, but this first sentence here gives a very, brief, simple overview, exactly like the subhead that I talked about. Taoiseach Micheál Martin and Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research and Innovation, Simon Harris, have today, 1 July, announced a new partnership between industry and the government to recruit and train research talent. That exactly sets out the narrative that they want. They're naming the 2 people responsible for this. They are saying, here is what was done, and the goal of it is to recruit and train research talent. This is a very positive connotation. That is the exact kind of tone they want to set for this. They then go into the quote-unquote information part. They talk about this is in collaboration with industry and the government of Ireland. The initial phase is going to look for 400 PhD candidates in research that tackles national and global challenges. And then they list all of these: climate change, climate adaptation, global health, pandemics, water poverty, digital society, and cybersecurity. They go here, they mention the stipend value that this is going to be valued at. And they also mention it's been benchmarked against similar scholarships internationally. And note what disciplines are included, being essentially STEM and arts, humanities, and social sciences. That is the information part of this press release. We then go into the quotes. We say, speaking today, Taoiseach, the role, Micheál Martin said, quote. Again, announcing the program, Minister Harris, role, name, quote. Once again, we go again, Philip Nolan, name, role, Director General of SFI, quote. We see Donald Slattery, once again, the role and association, and then another quote. And then the press release ends. They didn't put background context into this. When you're the government, especially when you are the Ministry of Higher Education, you don't need context. Any education correspondent, any national media, or even any local media is going to know the context. So you don't need it at this kind of a thing. But you see exactly that same structure here. And if you look at other press releases, you see the exact same thing. Let's look at how it's translated into this article. Headline, subhead. We actually see that they have a little bit more information here. This press release didn't mention the 100 million parts. And the headline itself is slightly more informative because it's actually mentioned the stipend value of the new research, and that's the PhD thing rather than simply talent. But ultimately, this captures the same sort of tone we saw in that press release. And then we look here, and this entire first part here is really interesting. Why? Because we see 28K stipend, Innovate for Ireland, right here, Taoiseach Michael Martin, Simon Harris. And then if we go down right here, this initial phase of the initiative will seek up to 400 high-caliber PhD students to undertake research into national global challenges, such as... This sounds exactly like the press release, almost word for word. And if you look at this paragraph here versus going over here, this paragraph here, you can see that parts of this have actually been exactly copy-pasted over between these two things. 400 high-caliber PhD students. We see again 400 PhD high-caliber students. So they just flipped the wording around slightly so it wouldn't be an exact match. And then we see again to undertake research into national and global challenges, such as to undertake research in Ireland that tackles national global challenges, such as. They literally did the high school student thing of copy pasting and changing a couple words so it wouldn't look like plagiarism. And then they have this exact same list delimited by semicolons here. And oh, look, the Irish Times delimited it by commas, but it's the exact same list. So they basically really did just do copy paste news on this straight out of the press release. Now, they mention a bit wider context and intended the program is going to grow to be much larger. So they clearly seem to have another source of information than just this press release, but they're not relying on that one too much. And a lot of the stuff, when we talk about Avalon here, we saw that in the press release as well. So we see that. And now we get into the quotes part of the article. Simon Harris said, the ministers said, and we go through that. The program managed through Science Foundation Ireland. Oh, I wonder who's coming up now. Director General of Science Foundation Ireland, Professor Philip Nolan, welcomed the partnership, quote. Donald Slattery, Chief Executive of Avalon, quote. Colin Hunt, Chief Executive of AIB, not mentioned in the press release actually, quote. And then, look at this. The context part, the background context part that I mentioned is very common to put in a press release. Right there, the exact same thing again. The last paragraph is context. And so you see that not only are these two press releases and the news article almost identical in content, not only do they literally copy paste at parts, but they follow the exact same structure. And if you look for this in news articles, you'll see this all over the place. So that is what these press releases are structured as, and you really want to do it because that's how they translate into news most effectively. And the easier it is to turn your press release into a news article, the higher chance you're going to get publication out of that. And obviously, if you're releasing a press release, you want publication. So there we go. We're going back to how to write a press release. There we go on that. Any questions on that structure, that template, or why that structure is used? All right, so heading on towards last couple of notes on how you write a press release. Few important things. Embargoes. If you put embargo in your press release, the word embargo, and then a date and a time, then supposedly news agencies cannot publish or talk about this publicly until that time has passed. If they receive the same information from another source, however, without an embargo, they can publish it. I say supposedly. It's very common for embargoes to be broken. I've done multiple protests where the embargo is broken, and it tipped off the people that we were protesting against that this was going to happen, and it was actually fine. It worked out better, actually, in those cases. But so you know, embargoes are commonly broken. They're not supposed to be, they shouldn't be, and it's unprofessional, quote unquote, to break them, but they're broken all the time. So ultimately, you know, if you've got something that's supposed to be super, super surprising, don't release it 2 weeks in advance, maybe release it a few days in advance, because you don't always trust the embargo, and the longer time you give, the chance that someone comes in on something and releases it too early increases. Second thing, right of reply. If you or your organization are mentioned, especially if that's negative, you have a right to reply to that. This can take one of two forms, either including the statement that you put out as right of reply in the original article, or publish a new article. If you think it's going to be publishing a new article, if this has been a few days that people aren't looking at the original anymore, you want to write this closer to a press release. If this is just you saw this and you're responding immediately because you want to get it, you know, strike while the iron is hot, you can just write this as a couple quotes. But you want to make sure you always take advantage of right of reply, because it gets more of your statements in the media. And the more of your statements go into media, the better you get. You know, the more attention you get, the more publicity you get. Small note on press advisories. This is the same thing as a press release, except instead of saying, you know, basically, here's your news article for you on a silver platter, what you are saying is, we are going to do this thing at this time and place. Please be there. This obviously works better once you've had history of press engagement. Same principles apply to a press advisory. Really, the only major change is instead of writing press release colon, you write press advisory colon, and then you're done. Last note on defamatory information. Press Council Ireland is the body that oversees all of the press in Ireland. They have a set of principles linked here. If those are violated, doxing, defamation, untruthful reporting, incorrect quotes, you can lodge an official complaint. The complaint process is also linked on this page. If you ever have false or defamatory information posted about you, about something that you've said about an organization you're part of, absolutely follow this pipeline. However, before you lodge an official complaint, it's the best idea to send a good faith email and say, hey, I saw this, you know, I noticed this is incorrect, could you please update? Because ultimately, the nicer you are to the press, the nicer they want to be to you. And as much as it shouldn't matter, writers and editors' personal opinions of you will matter. So make sure that those opinions are kept as strong as you can. Don't give them reason to dislike you. Quick one here, some news outlets. If you are publishing a press release, these are some of the most common Irish news outlets, both in Irish and in English. The English outlets, you can send them stuff in Irish. Almost every news outlet will have an Irish language branch. And similarly to the stuff that's in Irish, if you send something in English and they're really interested in it, they will almost certainly still follow up on that. Especially if it's a written media. If it's a radio media, it might be a bit harder because they don't have someone to bring on the radio to talk, but it's still worth sending. And so these are some of the very common ones you can use. Definitely not an exhaustive list, by the way. The true list of this could be like hundreds of emails long. But these are just kind of some common ones, and it really shows you it's typically news at whatever organization. So we have that. Couple notes on social media. This is going to be pretty quick fire. Treat social media like press releases. Any post that you make can and will be used in press articles. So only put out information you want to see quoted. The other general rules: be consistent in how you publish things. Publish at a consistent interval if you can. Be truthful, be professional. Know your audience. Twitter is still actually one of the most common for journalists and activism and advocacy groups. So if you are setting up an organization, you do want a Twitter to manage that, as well as some of the other accounts. Ask questions. That's a good way to drive engagement. Link to everything that you want people to see, because you want a center of information. And especially if you're looking to have a center of information and you don't have a website, which is obviously very useful, Linktree is very good for that. And I've seen quite a few people use that, especially when there's smaller groups that don't have their own websites yet. Those are some quick tips. You can read through this as you want. It's nothing surprising. People probably are mostly already knowledgeable and aware of these things, so I'll just leave that here as a reference point. So that is the basics and the important parts of media communications. Any last questions before I get into some Irish? All right, cool. So Irish. What's this about? So what I wanted to go through here is very specifically something that we went into last time, where I gave out all these templates, and at the time, obviously, and still is the case, it would have been difficult to insert in some parts of these templates because you might want something very, very, very specific, and you don't necessarily have that. If you're not fluent in Irish, or you're just not sure about a couple words, it might be very hard to say something like, I want, official insurance documents from X. That's a very complex phrase, especially in another language. This section is all about how do we do that? How do we construct these longer phrases that we can stick in to these sorts of things? Luckily, this is actually not that hard. There are two word orders you need to know for doing this. The first is noun and then adjective. So in Irish, teach gurm, or house blue, literally means a blue house. The other one is noun and then genitive. Genitive just means of. So if I say, house of cards, the of cards is the genitive. Irish doesn't really use the word for of very much. It just changes the noun. So this of becomes a part of the word. So if we look in English, we might say history book, which is a book of history. In Irish, it'll be Leabhar Starza. Leabhar is book, stars is history, and starza, with a little e at the end, means of history. So now it becomes book of history. And that's how we construct this. So basically, you've got first the thing you're talking about. You've got second, the way you want to modify, qualify, or specify that. The first part doesn't change, the second part does. How does that second part change? There are two ways I could have gone through this lesson. One of them is to painstakingly teach you all 5 declensions that I couldn't even write out myself. I just do them intuitively at this point. I couldn't even write out what the declensions are. The second one is to point you to an extremely intuitive and useful tool that solves all your problems for you with about 2 clicks. So I'm going to do that one instead. And I can pop in some links to, if you want to look at the declensions themselves, you're welcome to. You won't need it. And in fact, quite frankly, I just recommend you look through this enough and you'll pick up on the pattern yourself. I never memorized those rules. You really don't need to. But anyway, constructing phrases, nouns and adjectives here. What do? We know we have noun first, adjective second. So what do? We might have a word like capeis, which is a document, and ifigul for official. If you go into this site linked here, Tanglin, in fact, I'm going to pull it up right now so I can show you this live. They've got this thing here, in the middle, called the grammar wizard, where you can type in a noun. Here's your noun. And you can select an adjective, ifigul, here. And it is going to compute all the ways these nouns and adjectives can go together. So what we see here is we wanted official documents, plural. So that means we go here to the nominative, capeisi. The nominative means normal. When in doubt, always use nominative. Capeisi, documents, ifigula, plural. That's the plural version of the adjective. Don't worry about why it becomes ula instead of ul. That is all fine. We see that here, and we can just take that, copy and paste over into here. We say capeisi ifigula, official documents. So that is the way you put those together. How did you get those words? If you're looking for the word for document, how did you know that's the right word? Once again, I'm going to go home on Tanglin. You type in document, you go here, and you see a few words listed. If you aren't already fluent in Irish, you won't know what the difference between these words is. So you can click on a few of them. Let's click on the first one, Ducamaid, and then you go over to this one here, and you see the full list of definitions. Oh, this is just a document. And quite frankly, Ducamaid's ifigula is also perfectly fine. That is completely okay to say. You can click on this one. Once again, go to the Folklore Gaeilge Béarla on the left, and we now see more information here. We see the definition of document and also legal document. So really official legal stuff is what this is more linked to. So that might be a better word. And we can finally go back to the third option we had seen there for document, skriven. And we now see, when we go here, this is writing or a written document, and you see it used in phrases like to set something down in writing. So this is probably not what we're talking about. So you go between one of those first two ones, and that's how you can get that word. Similarly, if you type in official here, you will immediately see pop up, once it loads, ifigul. That's the word for it. In fact, that's the only word for it functionally, in terms of the adjective meaning in English. So you just take that one there. So that's the easy thing. You can get individual words that way very, very easily. And especially for most of the requests that we're doing, you're not likely to stumble into idiomatic things, because very formal Irish tends to be more literal than the colloquial or informal Irish, where you see a lot more idiom coming into it. So in a lot of cases, doing that is going to be completely fine. How about this one? How about combining nouns? We have seen before that you might want to send an FOI request for investment records. So here, investment is the genitive. It's a modifier to records. It's acting almost like an adjective, even though it's technically a noun. What the statement investment records means is records of investment. Not very surprising, records plural, investment singular. And we see of investment, which means that is now a genitive. Whenever you get this AB in English with nouns, you want to translate this to B of A. So investment records is records of investment. What you see here is that B is the base or the nominative noun, and A, the one that came first, is the one that should go into the genitive in Irish, which is why it's B of A. The of A is the genitive. Once again, you keep the nominative noun in its standard form. Where you see nominative here, you just keep that, either singular or plural, and change the genitive noun into what is labeled under genitive here. So if we want investment records, the word for record is tafid. Just trust me on that one. And we can go all the way through here, where we've got singular, plural, nominative, tafids with an I. There is records. There's the word for you. Now for the second part here, we have investment, inesticht. And we want this to be in the singular because it's records of investment, not investments. And we want this in the genitive. So we go here to singular, to genitive, and we see inestichte. You then take these, you put them together, and lo and behold, tafids inestichte. And there is what you're looking for there. You can take any of these, what we're going to call noun phrases. It's multiple words that act like a single noun. Because investment records of investment, it's a single thing. In English, I can say I have records of investment, just as well as I can say I have records. I have history books, just as well as I can say I have books. These phrases act like a single noun because all they are is a noun and then the things that qualify that noun. So in Irish, if we go back to any of these templates that I put out there, anytime something calls for a noun, you can just stick in one of these phrases there instead, and it's going to be fine. And those are kind of the key ways that you kind of go about combining this. Once you have this, and once you have Changlin, and you're going through this, you suddenly see very easily that filling in those templates is actually a really easy thing. The last thing I wanted to point out, which is this little tour of useful resources here. I showed you Tanglin already. I wanted to pull up this other one, folklore.ie. It's actually linked off of Tanglin if you just go to the top here, folklore.ie or .ie, sorry. And once again, what do we see here? This is just another dictionary. You can type in something like document, and you see here, this actually does a much better, it has a much better approach to English to Irish translation. It's much easier to get an Irish word off of the English one here, because it tells you, here's what we meant in English, here are the words that are used in Irish. You can even listen to it being said in all the different dialects and have examples of the way you combine this with other nouns, like historical documents or document, capesh, starza. And you see that right there. So a lot of the phrases you're looking for, or capesh tli, for example, are just sitting right there waiting for you. And you see this for all the different meanings of document that you would use in English, computer file, record on paper, and also the verb uses of it to give evidence support of, like to document a claim, and you immediately see that stuff here. And then related entries and a whole bunch of phrases this is used in. Oh, sorry, I clicked on the accent there. A whole bunch of phrases used in. So this is one of the best resources out there. Especially that quick translation or looking for these phrases you can insert. Anything you want is going to be here. And this one actually even has things like, if you look up climate change is a common enough term that climate change is just defined in this dictionary, as well as climate change denial and climate change denier are actually defined in that dictionary. The full phrases are there. Similarly, if we go back there, we even see climate change treaty has a whole entry here, which is Conora Eradza. And you can see for all those phrases, folklore.ie is really your friend. Anytime you're constructing that kind of stuff, anytime you have a template and you want to put something in, this is the way that you want to go about doing that. Obviously, part of it is knowing what to search, but once you're on folklore.ie, it makes that really easy for you. So that's a quick note on that, on the genitive and on adjectives and nouns in Irish. That is about that. That is the major point I want to cover, because that's really the last point on the FOIs, right? Of how to insert this, how to combine this, how to build this up properly. Because after that, once you have those templates, you're pretty much golden. Unfortunately, like I said, I couldn't really get press release templates out. I thought about it for a bit, but press releases are so variable in a way that FOIs aren't, that it's a bit tough to do. But like I said, you submit these in English and it doesn't really matter. The point is to get the information out there, less than the language you're submitting it in. So that was it for today. That is what I had written up for today. Next time, I'm going to do a quick tour of the GDPR and the Official Languages Act, and then hopefully actually get some more language-based exercises in. So as opposed to just, here's a couple of things about how to fill in a template, and here's a couple quick phrases and how to mutate it, hopefully getting a bit more into a bit more common things you can use in a rhetorical capacity. If you want to speak a bit of it, hopefully I'll be able to get some of that in a very good format next time. But in any case, that is that. If you would like, if you're able to, if you want to scan over these two things, like 5 minutes each, just to get a quick overview of GDPR and the Official Languages Act. If you don't, that's totally fine. I'll have all that for next session anyway. But yeah, that is that. Thank you so much. Here online watching later, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me a note. I'm going to end this recording. Okay, stop share. And where is it? Stop